Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation.
Hello and welcome to the Contrary. I'm host Bonnie Erbe. This week we speak with woman thought leader and book author Seyward Darby about her new book called Sisters in Hate. And it's all about the women of the far right movement. First of all, Ms. Darby, thank you for joining us. And tell me about your credentials, your background that gave you the ability to write intelligently on this topic, and what drew you to this topic?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. And I've been a magazine editor for a number of years. I started out at the New Republic, and then I was at Foreign Policy, and I'm now the editor-in-chief of the Atavist magazine. And along the way, I've been writing and reporting as a freelance journalist. And I've always been very, very interested in issues of social justice, racial justice. And after Trump's election in 2016, I had been following what at that time was considered, a resurgence of the far right and its support for his candidacy. And immediately after the election, as I was, like many people, really struggling to make sense of what had happened, I was struck by how in coverage of the far right, only men were ever quoted. And it was described as a lot of angry white men. And it struck me as probably wrong that it was nothing but angry white men, which isn't to say that it's not misogynistic, because it is a hyper misogynistic movement. But I was curious at why women were being written out of the story. And so it really started from that question. And I went looking for women of the far right. And initially I was focusing on the present moment. But then in the course of working on my book, I also did a lot of historical reading and research about women who have been active in various iterations of the far right going back over 150 years.
Let's start with the historical aspect of it, because just very coincidentally, I recently watched Birth of a Nation on YouTube just because I had never seen the whole movie. And so it's all about the birth of the KKK and the supposedly horrible African-American people in the South who, after the South lost, tried to take over and make the South a very uncomfortable place for white people. Of course, completely racist and historically inaccurate in its perception. However, it shows the women, and they were clearly involved in the founding of the KKK and clearly very supportive of the men who founded the KKK. So tell me about how they relate to the far right women today.
Absolutely. Yeah, Birth of a Nation, I watched it for the first time all the way through in college as a history, I believe in a history of film class. And it's a movie that I have no desire to ever watch all the way through again. But I do think it's so instructive from the standpoint of understanding the role that women have played in upholding structures and cultures of white supremacy across the country. And what's interesting about the depiction of white women in A Birth of a Nation is that they're very much these symbols of purity, of innocence, of something that can be tarnished if not protected, something that can be violated if not protected. And certainly the original KKK, as founded immediately after the Civil War, that was kind of their rallying cry, right? Was protecting the purity of whiteness, and particularly of white women, from violation, encroachment, and so women were symbols as much as anything else. What's interesting is that around the time that the KKK was really getting going, women were not just symbols; they were also important activists in particular, the United Daughters of the Confederacy was working to establish this idea of the lost cause. And, into the early 1900s, they were certainly erecting the statues we're still arguing about today, raising the funds for them, but also influencing textbooks and the way that the Civil War and the antebellum period were written about in texts that children across the country would read. And so, one of the things I found interesting in my research was realizing that the Birth of a Nation depiction of white women, even that in some ways is reductive, because I think it, positions them as, yes, supportive, but also sidelined in a way that isn't necessarily accurate to the historical record. And in the 1920s, when the KKK resurged and was at its zenith, women were actually crucial actors. A woman named Elizabeth Tyler was the key propagandist for the organization. She started a newspaper. She had a recruitment program, and women used their newfound right to vote to vote for people who they thought would support the KKK's agenda. And so, again, in looking at that and tying it to the present moment, women of the far right are certainly symbols. They still very much are, in this idea that we need to, as a race, protect white women from, violation, tarnishing, all these, sort of sexual notions. But at the same time, women have been very important political and social actors on the far right. And so and I continue to be very interested in that kind of duality of women as like representative of something for the far right, but also women as integral from an activist standpoint. So there's sort of, the thing that everyone's rallying around, but then oftentimes they're also the people who are helping organize the rallying.
So they believe the mythology of the Confederacy as being, the whole romantic, Gone with the Wind kind of, these guys are wonderful guys and they treated their slaves wonderfully, and they treated, they're not rapists, and they did rape not only slaves, of course, all the time, but their own women lots of the time. They beat their white women. So what makes women want to buy into this fantasy?
Sure. Well, I think that it's important to state first that the sort of lost cause neo-Confederate group, if you will. I mean, it's not a group, but people who that is sort of the fantasy that they believe in. That's just one slice of the contemporary far right. We also have neo-Nazis, many of whom are skinheads, and that's a very different culture. And you have the so-called alt-right, which doesn't really exist under that label anymore, but kind of these savvy digital neo-fascists. And what's interesting is they each have kind of this these different aesthetics and different points of history that they're interested in, but they all ultimately believe in the same core idea, which is that the white race, and particular in America, is under threat somehow.
There are factions that have different ideas about women. There are factions of alt-right who hate all women, who beat up on them in the most vulgar terms online, right, on the dark web, and also on the normally accessible web. What is it? Religion? Is it the whole Christian evangelical belief that bonds them to these abusive men?
Religion is another thing that's very diverse on the far right. You have people who are deeply, evangelical, but then you have people who are very overtly pagan, or certainly you have Catholics, and it's a very diverse space. Atheists, and I think that
there are atheists in the rebirth of the Confederacy. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, it's a very complicated, motley space, and I think that that's actually one of the reasons that it has defied a lot of public understanding over time. When you're talking about the more, how shall we say, run-of-the-mill misogyny, the men and women have different, natural attributes and skills and things like that, and everybody's meant to be in a certain place. I think some women in this space would say that that's not sexism, that is just the way of the world, and it's the way that a race remains strong. And so they see the sort of typical feminine role as empowering, of being a wife, of being a mother, of being a supporter, of being an organizer. And then with regard to the more virulent sexism and certainly the abuse, I think there's some mental gymnastics in play there, because what they will say, and what women who I interviewed who are involved in this space said, was those aren't our people. That's not who we are. The men that we associate with, they believe that women are the key to the future. White nationalism is something that preys on, as a social movement, it's something that preys on a lot of different aspects of American life and strands of American life. And so certainly conservative evangelical Christianity is one of those, because there are things about that ideology that map neatly onto a white nationalist ideology. But again, and I'll give the example of people who, consider themselves more pagan or like in touch with their, tribal ancestral roots. They talk a lot about like Northern European mythology. And those people have very similar ideas about what men and women should be, doing in their respective roles, that is shorn of the religiosity of conservative Christianity, but the actual fundamentals are the same about, it's natural that, women are kind of, it's a yin yang situation almost, like, and that, crossing over the divide between what makes a man and a woman is, only to the detriment of our race, if you will. So, so the Christianity aspect, and to be clear, like, it's, conservative Christianity has been a very important breeding ground, I think, for a lot of white nationalism, particularly in the last quarter century. And this isn't to diminish that at all. It's just to say that there really are these different strands.
But before we get into, and I do want to get how you ingratiated yourselves to these women and how you got them to trust you and talk to you. The last thing you mentioned, I guess, sort of talking about Nordic mythology, like Vikings and that sort of thing. What are the other, you talked about that and Christian evangelism. What other strands seem to pull these women into the movement?
Well, again, there's kind of this like neo-Nazi skinhead almost, we're anti-authority, if you will. And there's not a lot of traditional religion like inflected in there. But that's definitely one strand, and we've seen, a lot of that since the 1970s. And then you also have more of this, and this is, again, sort of the savvy digital neo-fascists, these people who, and I think that this has very much been enabled by Trump, frankly, people who are trying to seem, I'm not any particular fringe. I'm actually much more similar to you than you think. I have the right haircut. I wear the right clothes. I have my own blog, and they're more interested in seeming like they could be, part of the Republican Party, which frankly they could, and they are in some cases.
The Trump Republican Party for sure.
Right, exactly. And so, I mean, those are just a couple of the threads, but I think that, that last one is certainly the one that's been getting a lot of attention in the last couple of years because of the, dialogue surrounding the alt-right in 2016. And that one very much involves women, who consider themselves almost racist influencers. They don't call themselves racist, but are using things like YouTube and Pinterest and Instagram to, show what it means to be, a woman fighting for the white race in 2020. So, but to your point, I mean, I think we've sort of been circling around this. Why do women come to this? And the answer is that it's a hyper individualized phenomenon. So the reason that people are drawn into hate is not because of a particular deep-seated disdain that is outsized in comparison to, most baseline racism in the United States. Rather, they are people who are seeking something, and that need that they are seeking to fill becomes bigger than other needs. And so it could be searching for power, searching for camaraderie, searching for a sense of meaning, a community, or frankly, money. A lot of these people have platforms that are monetized, and hate as an emotion, as something that you think, I hate that person, I disdain that person. That's something that gets augmented and learned inside the movement, and becomes something that they perform as an act of being a part of the community, saying the language, the slurs, or in some cases participating in the violence. And so I remember one of my favorite quotes I read through my research was a sociologist who was asked in the 1990s, is there a standard profile of someone who gets involved in the hate movement? And her reply was, that would be comforting. And I think that she's right, because it would be comforting if you could just say, okay, well, if we can identify these 5 ingredients, but you can't. It's so much more individualized, and there's so much more work to be done to really understand, particularly now, how people are drawn into these spaces online.
Now tell us how you, as somebody they would see as a representative of the much hated liberal media, found them, got access to them, and got them to trust you.
Initially, right after the election, this was a very heady time, frankly, for the people of the far right, because they felt like they had won. Their unlikely candidate, or not that he was per se their candidate, but the candidate that they, supported had won, and he was promising to, do these things on immigration that they wanted. They liked how frankly he spoke. All these different things. And so when I initially started reaching out to women, and it was as simple as looking for them online, I found various YouTube channels and Twitter feeds and blogs and other spaces online where women's names and contact information were available. And I think that they really felt like this was their moment. That I remember one of them who I met and spoke to described how the alt-right was going to become a political party, how this was just the beginning of like their political renaissance. And so I think in some ways, some of the women who spoke to me right back then, this would have been early 2017, were sort of riding this high of the election. That being said, lots of women said no, and I was always very forthright about who I was. I, said what I believed politically, said I considered myself a feminist, said I didn't agree with their worldview, but also said, I'd like to have a conversation because I would like to understand. And that certainly made some people respond with absolutely not. I don't want to talk to, a feminist in the mainstream media. But then a few people did, and in some cases, some of those people encouraged other people to speak to me. And then over time, as the project expanded, I started speaking to formers, so people who used to be involved in this space but have since de-radicalized. And that really opened up a new, category in a way, because people who've left the movement are often much more willing to talk about their experiences because they, no longer see the press as the enemy, no longer see feminists as the enemy. So I also, was really able at that point to tap into a wider network of people. That being said, and the conclusion of my book goes into this, as a journalist, I spent many hours feeling inadequate because, people were saying no, and they kept saying no. And I would ask again, and they would say no again. And I hate dead ends, right? As a journalist, you just want to get somebody to finally say, yes, and pick up the phone. But then I ultimately realized that it was part of the story, that their not wanting to talk to the media was an indication, first of all, of, what they think of the media, but then also the fact that in this day and age, they don't need the traditional media. They have so many platforms, so many messaging systems, so many ways of, spreading their message without any, enforcement of truth or anything like that. And so that to me, when it finally dawned on me that, I wasn't failing so much as I was not seeing an important thread of the story. And so I tried to make that part of the book as well.
So do you think the internet and social media is what has allowed this major resurgence of white nationalism? I remember thinking when President Obama was elected that there were large factions of rural white America who didn't spend much time with people of color, weren't familiar with people of color, and there might be some sort of political backlash. And lo and behold, in 2016, we got Donald Trump.
One of the statistics I found most striking in my research, and it came from the Southern Poverty Law Center, was that in 2009, so the first year of Obama's full presidency, the website Stormfront, which is the oldest, far-right neo-Nazi site on the internet, dating back to 1994 and 1995, saw a surge of like 100,000 new users, which is a lot. On the one hand, 100,000 people, not that many Americans percentage-wise, but it was a huge uptick if you looked at, where the registrations were before. But then also, to me, not everybody who thinks it's not a good idea to have a Black man in the White House finds it, un-American or whatever. Not every single one of those people is going to join Stormfront. And so to me, that number actually looked like something bigger. In 2009, the Department of Homeland Security issued a memo saying, we're seeing a lot of uptick in white nationalist or white supremacist rhetoric online, and we're seeing a lot of recruitment, and like this is a scary moment. That report was buried, more or less. And I think, in this moment, and certainly, since 2016, I think it was a combination of, yes, there were people who hated the fact that, Obama had been president all that time, and it had as much to do with his policies as it had to do with, the color of his skin, frankly. But then they had someone like Trump who was speaking their language. And, one of the things I'm interested in right now is, in the midst of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter protests, I think there will be backlash to that. There's certainly chatter on the far right internet about how, this is a terrifying moment for the white race. The BLM is a terrorist organization. All these things that are just, patently false. But the other thing I will say, and I found this so deeply important in my research, is that these people are drawing from a communal well of white supremacy. The things that they believe about what it means to be American, what politically the country should look like, what the nature of American history is. Those things are actually the things that they're talking about are, I think, beliefs, ideas, myths that are held by a much larger percentage of the population. They are perhaps exaggerating them, or they are, exposing them or speaking bluntly about them, but it's not as though they have these wholly original ideas. They're taking things that are very much at the root of America as we know it and making it their raison d'etre, but also, putting their own spin, frankly, on it, and making it into something more upsetting. And I think that allows the mainstream to other the far right and think of them as, they must be crazy, like they're weirdos, they're just such hateful, horrible people. When in fact, if you really bear down and look at what it is that they believe, the way that they speak, it's not so different than the way you hear other people speak.
What do you mean? Who are women who are othered, and how should they be dealt with instead to become advocates, if at all possible, of a more diverse society, which is ultimately where America is headed, regardless of where they want it to head?
I think that, a very important, and this is something I think about constantly now, every day, and things that I say, decisions that I make are, what are the things that I'm doing and how am I moving through the world in ways that the women of the far right might actually approve of. And I think that, when we think about opportunity hoarding or, decisions that you're making just in the interest of your children, but they're decisions that reinforce inequality, or that, are frankly involve coded language about things like race. I think it's important for women especially, men certainly, but I think women, as such important social actors, to look at the ways in which what they're doing is helping perpetuate white supremacy, the very white supremacy that the far right feeds on. And I'm certainly not the first person to say this. There are especially, a lot of women of color who for decades now, have been saying basically, white women, check yourselves. Like, you think you're on the right side of things, but you're not. And I think that that's hard work, obviously. But I think it's really necessary work because the women of the far right are very savvy in trying to appeal to mainstream women by saying, I too am just making decisions about, my children and my community. I too am just trying to, lead my life in the way that makes me feel happy and fulfilled and comfortable. And all the things that, you're not even bringing race per se into it at that point. But I think it can be very alluring to hear that kind of talk, and they know that. And so I think it's important to recognize the points of familiarity and then work to, untangle our own complicity with various forms of white supremacy.
Well, thank you so much for your 3 years of work pulling this together and helping people who cannot understand how women would be, or at least at first blush, think to themselves, how could women be involved in this? To bridge that knowledge gap somehow. I've been speaking with Seyward Darby, who wrote the book Sisters in Hate about women in the white nationalist movement. That's it for this edition of To the Contrary. Please join us during the week on social media. You can visit our website at pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, please join us next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/to the contrary.